So for the last several weeks, we've been looking at some of the tools for theological thinking that are a part of our Wesleyan heritage. You may recall that John Wesley talked about 3 different aspects of grace: prevenient grace, and justifying grace, and sanctifying grace. Those 3 aspects, it's like a sandwich cookie, like an Oreo with the 2 sides in the middle, the 3 different parts. But really it's just all part of one grace, God's grace, but we look at it in different ways. And first, we talked about, there's prevenient grace, which we talked about in depth last Sunday. Prevenient grace, as a reminder, is God's pursuing grace. It's God's grace tugging at our heartstrings, wooing us into a relationship with God, drawing us to God, kind of like a magnet draws metal. Prevenient grace means to come before, and it refers to God's grace present and at work in our lives even before we are aware of it. It's that grace which also makes possible our response of faith, our response to God. The second part of that sandwich cookie, if you will, the second aspect of God's grace is what we call justifying grace. And it's that grace which allows us to see that we are not living as God would have us live, that we are not connected to the God who creates us, that we are estranged from or separated from God. It also is the grace that helps us understand that we don't have to earn favor with God, that we don't have to earn a relationship, that God's love is something that is unconditionally and freely offered to us. We don't have to be worthy of that love or that grace. All we have to do is say yes to God, to God's offer of relationship. Yes to this freely given, holy, unmerited, undeserved love of God. And justification then is that moment when we say yes to God, when we accept for ourselves the gifts of God's love and the grace that is offered to each one of us. You remember perhaps the story of the prodigal son, how he demanded that his father give him his inheritance up front, even before his father's death, because he wanted to go off and live life on his terms, to live life as he wanted to live life. And so he did, and he went off into a far country, and he wasted his inheritance on less than holy living. And then he came to a point where he hit bottom, so to speak. And he found himself in serious want. And then he wanted nothing more than to be back home with his father. He was even willing to just go back as a servant, not as a son. And he did. And he turned around and headed back to God, to his father. Justifying grace helps us understand that with God there is nothing that we have to do to earn God's love, to earn God's favor. It's wholly a gift. All we need to do is trust the one who comes for us, to realize that our salvation lies in Jesus the Christ, the one who comes to lead us back home again to the God who first created us. And that brings us to that third aspect of grace, what we call sanctifying grace. And that's what I want to talk mostly about this morning. Sanctifying grace is that grace which enables us to live into the people God has created us to be. It's that grace that helps us renew our relationship with God to become the person we were intended to be all along. The prodigal son came home, returned to his loving father, but then there came a time of hard work, of reestablishing and developing the relationship that he and his father were always meant to have. Sanctification, simply put, refers to our growing in God's grace. Being Christian doesn't stop when we are, quote, born again spiritually, just as being a human being doesn't stop at physical birth, does it? We need nourishment. We need growth. And we must allow God to reshape us. Sanctifying grace is the work of God's Holy Spirit working in us and with us to move us ever closer to that ideal God created us to be. In the Wesleyan heritage, we talk about going on to perfection. And I think I said to you a few weeks ago, as United Methodist ministers, when we ordain, one of the historic questions we still answer when the bishops still ask at our ordination is, are you going on to perfection? And again, that doesn't mean that we become perfect people without mistakes, because clearly we are not and cannot, right? But what Wesley was talking about is that we continue to grow with the help of God's grace, working with God through our response of faith to become more and more who God created us to be. We work to more fully live out who we were created to be. And it's kind of, the word that comes to mind in all of this is synergy. It's God's grace already present, prompting our awareness of our need for God, prompting our response to God. Our faith then is that response, but then as we continue to grow in grace, we do other things that help shore up that relationship, that help pull us closer to God, that help us understand God and be more fully in relationship with God. And that whole process is what we call sanctification or sanctifying grace, growing closer in our relationship with God. And if you're like me, that's not a straight line kind of thing. For me, this whole growing in grace, growing in my relationship to God, that development of my faith is very much a journey. In fact, sometimes it's like a roller coaster. It's up and down and all around. But that's pretty much an accurate description of my relationship with God. It's up, it's down, it's all around. It twists, it turns. Sometimes I'm closer to God, and other times I'm far away. But I continue to work at it. I continue to put myself in a position to hear God's call on my life, if that makes sense. And one of the ways we do that is through what we call the spiritual disciplines. And what we're going to do over the next several weeks, starting next Sunday with the first Sunday of Lent, is each week we're going to look at one of those spiritual disciplines that help us grow in grace, help us grow in our relationship to God, help us hopefully feel more connected to, more closer to God, help us listen to God's voice speaking to us, helping mold us into the people God has called us to be, if that makes sense. The title of this series that's coming up for Lent is called Listening. Listening to that still small voice of God speaking in our world, in our lives, and responding to that. And putting ourselves in places to actually hear God speak through these various spiritual disciplines. And that's just that part of sanctification, of growing more perfect in love of God and neighbor. And again, that's what Christian perfection is. It's not being perfect, and that's where I got lost, I think. It's not being perfect. It's about growing toward perfection and love of God and neighbor. And again, I said this last week or the week before, Wesley didn't think we necessarily ever attain that, but that is the goal of the Christian life. Our goal, if you will, is to grow more perfect in our love of God, which then, of course, is expressed in our love of one another, right? So this is all about growing, and it's kind of like, I don't know if I can find my place again. But like I said, my journey's been all over the map. And I've certainly not arrived, but I do try to keep growing into the person God has called me to be. You know, when we say yes to God, the reality is that wondrous things begin to happen. Not miraculous or instantaneous transformation, but slow, sometimes fitful growth with stops and starts and ups and downs, and times when our cups runneth over, and times when we walk through the valley of the shadow of death. And so we believe that we must continue to say yes to God, not just at that one-time moment of our conversion, if you will, but we say yes to God again and again through this journey we call faith. And then gradually we are created more and more. We grow into that image of God in which we are created. So sanctifying grace is that which gives us the desire and the ability to get serious about nurturing and sustaining that relationship with God. And with time, we come to understand more and more about who God is and about who we really are in relationship to God. We allow that grace to work in our lives. But again, it's a synergistic process. We have to cooperate with God's grace if we are to become the people God intended us to be. And I think that's what the passage I read from Philippians is talking about in working out your own salvation. No, we don't save ourselves. It is God who brings us salvation. But we have to cooperate with God's grace if we're to find that wholeness. Remember, salvation is wholeness, that wholeness that is offered to us through our relationship with God in Jesus the Christ. One of the analogies we often use in the Christian faith is that of a growing plant. Jesus tells the parable of the seeds falling on poor soil among the weeds and on productive earth. And so our job as people growing in grace is a part of that sanctification process is to make our lives like productive earth, ready to receive the seeds God gives us. We must receive that grace that comes to us. We must respond by allowing it to literally transform who we are. We don't make plants grow, right? But we can keep them from growing. I can attest to that because I can kill just about any plant I ever get my hand on. I can't make a plant grow, but I can certainly keep one from growing. Seeds become fruitful plants only if they put down very healthy roots. So we have to prepare that soil. We have to work to keep it fertile for that growing plant. We must till and fertilize and prune and water and weed. And we do that by staying in relationship with God, by continuing to work at, pay attention to, nurture that relationship that begins when we say yes to God's grace in our lives. And we do that by reading Scripture and praying and worshiping and perhaps participating in an accountability group or celebrating the sacraments or living out our lives in acts of mercy and justice. And again, beginning next Sunday, we're going to talk about some of the ways we continue to work that soil we call our lives and make it more fertile for God's grace to take root. Again, we can't make ourselves perfect in Christian love any more than we can cause a plant to grow. But what we can do is allow God's grace to grow freely in our lives. And so justification or justifying grace is the beginning of a journey. It's certainly not the end. Disciples are those who are striving to become more and more like Jesus in how they live out their daily lives. And I'm so far from that. But it doesn't mean I quit trying. It doesn't mean I don't put myself in places to grow as a disciple. Because we are to be transformed by God's grace at work in our lives, and then we as disciples are called to go out and transform the world. The mission statement of the United Methodist Church as a whole is to be disciples of Jesus Christ for the transformation of the world. Sanctifying grace empowers us to move forward in discipleship and to move out in mission and ministry to others. In Paul's letter to the Hebrews, chapter 12, 1 through 13, Paul talks about the cloud of witnesses, those disciples who came before us. I like what Eugene Peterson's, not really a translation, it's more of a paraphrase of the Bible, the Message, puts it this way. Do you see what this means? All those pioneers who blazed the way, all those veterans cheering us on, it means we'd better get on with it. Strip down, start running, and never quit. No extra spiritual fat, no parasitic sins. Keep your eyes on Jesus who both began and finished this race we're in. It continues, study how he did it, because he never lost sight of where he was headed. That exhilarating finish in and with God. He could put up with anything along the way, the cross, shame, whatever. And now he's there. in the place of honor, right alongside God. When you find yourselves flagging in your faith, go over that story again. And item by item, that long litany of hostility he plowed through. And that will shoot adrenaline into your very souls. I love the way he paraphrases that. It really speaks to us, correct? Right? So sanctifying grace is that which allows us to run the race, to continue this journey we call faith, to grow strong, to reach for Christ, to become more like Christ. May we all continue to grow in God's amazing grace that we might be transformed and therefore be agents of transformation for this world in which we live. Thanks be to God.